Good morning, everybody. As part of Construction Safety Week, we're going to do a brief webinar this morning on hazardous substances in the workplace. Okay. So just to summarize, what is occupational health? Occupational health encompasses a range of work activities, and when work is associated with any one of 8 hazards as identified in the figure in the slide, it can result in disease or illness. This morning we're going to talk about hazardous substances as one of those potential 8. Procedures and risk assessments are put in place to protect all of us from disease or illness and conditions which are hazardous to health in the workspace. Okay. So what is a hazardous substance? What could a hazardous substance be when you're working in EPS? It can be either in gas, liquid or solid form, which may have the potential to cause harm. That's what the definition of it is. Such substances include substances that were brought directly into the workplace and handled, stored and used for processing. Examples would be resins, solvents, glues, paint. We tend to use a lot of solvent for cleaning PVC pipework before we glue it together. So both the solvent and the glue there are examples of hazardous substances. In the fabrication business, we tend to use a lot of paint and mild steel. So that's another example. The second example would be where we generate a hazardous substance through a work activity. That would be fumes generated in welding. It would be dust if we're using grinders or con saws or road saws. And we can also generate hazardous substances as a waste or byproduct or a residue. Again, that would be, an example would be carbon monoxide produced from a diesel engine driven MUP, for example. How do these hazardous substances enter our bodies? There are 4 main routes into the human body. Okay, the first one is inhalation, by breathing in contaminated air. That's the most common one. Second one is ingestion, that's swallowing it. The third is absorption, where your skin isn't a fully sealed barrier, so it's a permeable membrane. And some substances can pass through the human skin. And the fourth is by injection, where a sharp object like a needle punctures the skin and injects a chemical directly into the bloodstream. Safety data sheets and COSH risk assessments are something that a lot of people working in EPS are quite familiar with, okay? And they encounter them in their daily work. Anyone that's purchasing chemicals, using chemicals, either in operation or in construction activities, lubricants for oil, for gearboxes, for example, diesel for generators, or petrol for smaller generators, all have to carry safety data sheets and COSH risk assessments. It's mandatory that they're obtained from suppliers when you're purchasing substances which are potentially dangerous. And the safety data sheet typically provides information on how you handle the material, how you store it, how you dispose of it after use at end of life, how you dispose of the containers, and the control measures and the emergency measures and hazards associated with it. Most of us are familiar with the international symbols for corrosive materials that are shown on the right of the slide there, for toxic, for corrosive, for inflammatory, etc., etc. It's a legal requirement that a COSH risk assessment has to be completed and maintained, okay? That and the safety data sheet must be maintained as a live document at the point of use, okay? And it's really important that the information contained within these documents is made available to people that are handling, using substances. And it's also important to maintain this as a live working document. It's a legal requirement. We're legally obliged as an organisation to maintain a chemical register throughout our organisation, where we store chemicals, how we dispose of them, etc. Exposure to sewage is something which is very common for a lot of our workforce. A significant percentage of our people are exposed or potentially exposed to sewage on a daily basis, whether they're involved in construction on existing live sites, whether they're involved in service and repair on equipment on site or equipment which comes back to our service and repair facility from a site. You can still have a sewage attached to it. And we also have a large team of people that are operating and maintaining sewage treatment facilities. Now, sewage treatment in itself does not destroy the pathogens, viruses and bacteria that are associated with sewage. So even if you're talking about treated sewage, treated wastewater, you may have removed all the nutrients in it or a high percentage of the nutrients in it, but you haven't removed the bacteria and viruses and pathogens that are associated with sewage. So it's very important to remember that when you're working with sewage, okay? Exposure to sewage or treated effluent or sludge can result in a number of illnesses, and they include gastroenteritis, which is diarrhea and vomiting. Okay, typically that's caused by ingestion of E. coli-based bacteria. Weil's disease is transmitted generally from rats. It's carried by rats, by the female rat, and as we know, in a lot of wastewater sewage treatment plants, there's always going to be a rat population. So it's very important that when in a wastewater treatment plant that you always wear gloves. Where a rat may have urinated, if you put down your hand on, and it can be on tools, it can be on a wall, it can be on walkways, floors, worktops, inside in control panels. If you don't wear gloves, you always have the potential to pick up Weil's disease. And if you smoke, eat or drink without washing your hands, having come in contact with Weil's, there's a high probability that you'll become infected by it. And it's quite a debilitating illness, okay? And it can lead to death in some situations. Hepatitis, Hep C, is another potentially dangerous condition that you can develop having been exposed to sewage. Typically, people that interact with live sewage that work within EPS are vaccinated for hepatitis. And if you haven't been, for some reason, vaccinated for hepatitis and you do work with live sewage, then please contact your supervisor to arrange for same. Okay. Then there are a number of pulmonary complaints which are less common that can be caused by exposure to sewage and wastewater. Next question for us is, how do biological agents, or how can they potentially enter our bodies? I suppose the most common way is hand to mouth. That's where we've been in contact with biological agents and we haven't worn PPE or haven't washed our hands properly after being exposed to it when we go eating, drinking or smoking. In my view, and it's, I suppose, the thinking in EPS is, if you're working on a live wastewater treatment plant, you should wear gloves at all times, okay? Second most common way that biological agents can enter your body is inhalation, by breathing in a dust or an aerosol. An example of that is where we have an inlet screen in a treatment plant and we're washing it with high pressure water typically. That tends to generate an aerosol, okay? And you can potentially carry pathogens from the wastewater in that aerosol, and you can breathe in that aerosol. That's why we have inlet screens covered with an enclosure. That's why there's a limit switch on that, so that when you open that enclosure, you automatically stop the washing of the screen. That's an example of a remedial measure that we have put in place to avoid breathing in pathogens or biological agents. Third is by skin contact, where you have cuts, scratches or abrasions on your skin, on your hands typically, and you're working with live sewage without PPE. Again, at all times, if you have cuts and abrasions on your hands, and it's nearly impossible to avoid them if you're working as a craft person in the field, then it's mandatory that you wear PPE, you wear gloves, and you have proper covering over any abrasions on your skin to make certain sure that you don't get biological agents entering your body. And I suppose it's always at the back of our minds that people, when dealing with raw sewage, that there can be hypothermic needles disposed of in sewage. So be really careful if you're clearing out pumps or any kind of macerators or mixers, that you don't come in contact with hypothermic needles. And if you are, you should wear proper PPE, which protects you from damage by hypothermic needles. Okay, always be wary of it when you're clearing out equipment, particularly equipment which is used on the preliminary side of a treatment plant. That's typically where hypothermic needles tend to end up. Okay, control measures. And the common theme in the HSQE world is, number one, if there's a hazard, try and eliminate that hazard. That's number one. That's the first step we should always try and take by changing the process or the product that we're using. Second step is substitution. If we can't eliminate it, substitute with something less hazardous, a less hazardous chemical or agent. Okay. Now, where in lots of cases we can either do one or two. In cases where we can't either eliminate it or substitute it, then we have to put in control measures which reduce or mitigate the risk to our employees. So it's number one is elimination, number two is substitution, and number three is control measures. So control measures examples would be an enclosure, which the example of the preliminary works inlet screen, which I mentioned previously, where you're washing it, that's a control measure there. Okay, that's an example of it. So ventilation of an area is another example. So for instance, where we're dewatering sewage sludge in a building, typically we'll order extract from that building at a certain number of air changes per hour. If it's an occupied building, it'll typically be 6 air changes per hour. Okay, and that extracted air then is treated in an odor treatment unit. That's an example of ventilation, a control measure for using ventilation. The third area would be use of effective PPE. So if we have to go down into a sump and there's potentially toxic gas in there, we would use full BA equipment as a mitigation measure. So in summary, a hazardous substance can be either chemical or biological. It's a good practice to complete a list of hazardous substances which are present in your workplace, whatever aspect of the business you work in. Make sure each hazardous substance has a safety data sheet and a COSH risk assessment. Know where the hazardous substances are located, how they're being used, who's using them, who's exposed to them, and make sure that they have the correct PPE when they're using them. Know exactly the risks that they pose and the mitigation measures that need to be in place. Check the necessary controls are in place all the time and identify corrective actions to be taken where controls are lacking. And that's one that we're really strong on. If you're using hazardous substances or you're potentially exposed to them and you're not happy with the corrective actions are in place and the controls are not in place, please contact your supervisor and point that out to them so that we can put them in place. Thank you for your time.